So what are fossil fuels? Easy enough to answer in many ways. Coal, natural gas, and petroleum, oil. But things get much more complicated when we start thinking about the time involved in the making of these fossil fuels and the time involved in consuming them. Things also get much more interesting and complicated and hairy when we start talking about the role fossil fuels have played in human history. And since in this course we're continually on track, tracking down and trying to elaborate and inspect and analyze the way political ecology works. So the ways in which the impacts on the environment from fossil fuels impact our political lives and the public sphere and democratic politics. So these are some of the things we're going to talk about today. And we're going to look at many different artists and different artworks that tackle this issue from multiple vantage points, multiple places. So let's start with two primordial scenes within geological history. So we're kind of picking up a little bit off of last week where we talked about geological time, the Holocene, and then the so-called Anthropocene, and what we called non-human timescales. So when we go back, I have such a hard time understanding what it means to think back 359 to 299 million years ago. It's so long ago. This is called the Carboniferous period. And it's called Carboniferous period for a reason, because this is when carbon first started to develop. This is when we had these incredibly high trees that are called lepidendrons, and they dominated a tropical Earth. Earth was tropical. When they sank into the mud and then were deprived of oxygen, these plants, these lepidendrons, hardened into carbon, into what we now today call coal, right? So once more, we're calling back to the meeting point between human and non-human temporality. So a time scale of millions of years, and then of non-human geology, of non-human geological time. And then, if you think about it, humans have been using coal for centuries, but of course it really accelerates at the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. And so think about it. It took millions of years for these coal deposits from these lepidendron trees to be produced. But it's looking like just a matter of generations within human time and human history for it to be consumed, for it to be burned for energy, right? This is incredible. This is an incredible meeting place between two temporalities. It's like we're meeting up with this primordial scene that was well before we came on the scene of this planet, and time is collapsing, right? This also happens with the other primordial scene that has to do with fossil fuels, and that's petroleum, right? So again, try to think back 10 to 200 million years ago. This is when we'd have microorganisms, like mainly algae and zooplankton, that these microscopic organisms that would undergo intense heat and pressure over these millions of years. And what did that heat and pressure change these organisms into? Petroleum, right? So petroleum is the residue of prehistoric, very, very old life forms, small life forms, that now can be converted into energy, and that in many ways drives our lives, our contemporary modes of living. So us as living Homo sapiens are in many ways connected directly through petroleum to these microscopic organisms of millions and millions and millions of years ago, right? So it's just really fascinating to think about these different time scales. So now I'm going to show you a work that seems to, in many ways, visualize or make concrete this meeting point between non-human geological time and human time. And that's this wonderful work by Brian Jungen called Cetology. Cetology is, if you don't know, it's the study of dolphins, of whales, of mammals, our fellow mammals that live and evolved in the ocean. And so if you've ever been to the Natural History Museum in New York, you'll probably have seen, it's unmissable, that gigantic blue whale that's hanging in one of the larger rooms, one of the larger halls, really, in the Natural History Museum. And so this seems to be, he's kind of calling attention to this natural history type of aesthetic by showing this, this skeleton of this large whale hanging from the rafters of a gallery. And why does this harken back or allude back to fossil fuels? Well, it does so in two ways, which is what, at least two ways, maybe more. So the first is, they're called fossil fuels for a reason. They were produced by fossilized organisms, like I just said. So it was largely, by and large, microscopic organisms, but also prehistoric animals, right? And so by presenting this skeleton of a whale, which we could almost think of, it's not fossilized, but there's like a time or an allusion to fossils here, right? But what's maybe more interesting than that, and if you have a good eye, can you tell what is this made of? It's a little hard to tell, but it's all one thing, which means it's modular. It's like Legos. Like the individual components are all the same here. They're all plastic chairs. This whole incredible sculpture is made out of plastic, white plastic chairs that we've all seen. And so how does that connect to fossil fuels? Well, how do we make plastic? For the most part, plastic historically has been made through petroleum. So in this work, there's this incredible collapse between the fossil, between prehistoric time, and then, human activity, petroleum, and then just, like a mundane plastic chair that we don't even think about. And this tells us something important about how we live in our contemporary period, is the idea that petroleum, fossil fuels, this one fossil fuel, it's everywhere. It's all around us. In fact, as what we can't help but think after today's session is that our mode of life today would have been impossible without fossil fuels as it stands, as it is today. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to move away from fossil fuels, right? We definitely do. But it's interesting to think past on recent history, on the past 200 years, and think, well, the way in which history unfolded would have been impossible without fossil fuels and without petroleum. So more on that later. So this work by Brian, and I might not be pronouncing his name correct, Jungen, is very much taps into this idea of petroleum being all around us, being very mundane. And there's another work by this artist named Brett Bloom. It's this wonderful chart called petrosubjectivity. And what he means by, petro is, the petroleum. Subjectivity, in this case, he means how we are formed as individuals, like how we understand ourselves in the world. This is called being subjectivized, which is something that happens usually from the outside, from your parents, from the cultures and traditions and societies that you live in, but also from the economic forces and the political forces that we find ourselves in inevitably as we grow up and as we become subjects, right? So this chart, this graphic by Brett Bloom, is pretty amazing. He goes and shows you how crude oil, petroleum, is turned into all these different things that we consume, that we rely on, including this computer that I'm using to record this lecture for you. It's tied to fossil fuels and to petroleum. So it's really amazing work, and it's a little small. So it might be a little hard to read some of the captions, although the captions are really interesting. But I would recommend just pausing it for, like just a few seconds or a minute or something, and just read through it and trace all the arrows and see where they all lead. And it's incredible. It's incredible where they all lead, and how it encompasses so many different products and so many different parts of our lives. So yeah, go ahead and give it a pause if you'd like, and be surprised about all these things that come from petroleum. And so, speaking of petroleum and fossil fuels being all around us, and maybe one of the most pressing issues of it being all around us is the fact that it's not only made into products, right, but the byproduct of burning and using fossil fuels for energy leads to greenhouse gases and leads to pollution, leads to an altered air, right, that we breathe and that we live in. So this is a major issue that we need to kind of know and understand. And there's an artist, her name is Amy Balkin. I highly recommend going to her website. You would just search for Amy Balkin. Her website comes up. She's done all sorts of wonderful works on global warming, on air pollution, on smog, and on the presence of fossil fuels in the air we breathe and in our atmosphere. Which again is one of the most pressing issues of our times. And so in this work, which is ongoing, it's called Smog Index, Amy Balkin Smog Index. It's really wonderful. You can actually go, this is separate from her website, but you can go to a Tumblr page called smogindex.tumblr.com. And the work is almost like a crowdsourced work of art. She invites people, anyone from around the world, to document the smog that they see in their everyday lives all throughout the world. So this is an example of the sun in China, which is, along with Mexico City, along with Tehran, along with a number of different cities, in major cities in the world that are near the fossil fuel production. Smog is a serious issue. There's a report that just came out recently. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's staggering how many people die every year because of the burning of fossil fuels and the side effects on human health. It's incredibly toxic. So this is just one example, one image that was taken of many. One of you, one day on an especially maybe bad day in New York City, if we see pollution, I'm remembering the forest fires from last year from California that made it all the way to here, and we could see it in the air in New York City. One day, that day, maybe someone has taken a picture. They could upload that onto the Tumblr page and be part of this work. So it's about making air pollution more present, and in a global outsourced sort of way as a work. She's also done something pretty radical. It's a wonderful work where it's a petition, an urging of making the air, Earth's atmosphere, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which then would lead to all sorts of protections. World Heritage Sites, designated World Heritage Sites by UNESCO all around the world. They're protected. They can't be used for financial speculation and so on and so forth. So what better UNESCO World Heritage thing or site could there be than the very air that we all depend on and breathe every day, right? So it's a very transgressive work because it's almost utopian. Because to think of Earth's atmosphere as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, well, we got to stop dumping pollution into this air, this World Heritage Site, right? But it makes all the sense in the world, so it's not really utopian. You know what I mean? So it's a really wonderful work, and again, I recommend going to her website and checking out some of her work. She's a really wonderful artist, and I'm sure her work is going to come up again in our conversations and in my lectures. And so why is it so important to think about the burning of fossil fuels and the emissions from fossil fuels? Well, it relates to global warming, and it relates to the greenhouse effect. And so this is really important to know in a general sense. What is the greenhouse effect? We've known about it for a century or so. And we know that life on Earth, as we know it, and our life, would not have been possible without the greenhouse effect. Without the greenhouse effect, I can't remember the exact number, but the temperature of the Earth on the long climate, the run of climate, would be 60 degrees lower. So it would be uninhabitable. So the greenhouse effect warmed up the planet through the sun's energies and ultraviolet radiation to a temperature that made the Holocene possible. And not just the Holocene, but the Holocene possible, in which all of human civilization unfolded so far, and which made this planet like a habitable sweet spot, because we can only live in certain temperatures as Homo sapiens. And so what is the greenhouse effect? If I've just described it as something that we absolutely have to be able to live on this planet, why is the greenhouse effect bad? Why in 1985, Carl Sagan, in 1988, James Hansen, why did they testify in front of Congress to warn about the greenhouse effect? Well, it's a little bit too much of a good thing, which sometimes is a truism. Too much greenhouse effect, and things get too hot, right? So when we emit more carbon dioxide, mainly, but also methane into the air and other greenhouse gases, more heat gets trapped from the sun, and the more things get warm. So this explains anthropogenic global warming. Anthropogenic in the sense that it's created by human industry and activity, and warming in the sense that the climate, you've seen, I'm sure, that very famous chart of rising temperatures since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and years are getting only hotter and hotter and hotter. And today I'm looking out the window, and this is weather, so it's not climate, so we should be careful about that. But I can't help but think that the fact that it's sunny and 60 degrees right now on February, early February, seems to be a little strange, right? Though again, that's weather, that's just one day, that's not climate, which is a much longer trend. So the greenhouse gas is a process that occurs when gases in the Earth's atmosphere trap the sun's heat, and this process makes the Earth warmer. Okay, it warms things up. So some of the Earth's energy makes it back up into the atmosphere. Some of it gets sequestered, largely by oceans, but also by forests like the Amazon. And some of it goes back up, but then gets trapped, right? Traps in the atmosphere because of greenhouse gases. So on the website, it's just so important to know. I've just given you a general idea of what the greenhouse effect is like. But I'm going to give you a quote. It's short, but please, I would really advise pausing. It'll take you a minute to read. But I'm giving you about a paragraph from Joseph Romm's Climate Change, What Everyone Needs to Know from 2016. It goes into more specifics about how the greenhouse gas effect works. Because again, this is knowledge, this is common knowledge that I think everyone should have in their back pocket. So pause the video again and just read that real quickly, and then we'll pick back up. So we've talked about what fossil fuels are. We've thought a little bit about how they surround us in our everyday lives, and we've talked about how they contribute to and how they affect the climate and the science of the greenhouse effect, which is leading to anthropogenic global warming. But now I want to turn to the question of political ecology, which is how do fossil fuels affect our political lives? How does it affect society and politics, even geopolitics of war, and the use of of global economies within the global political landscape. This is a huge topic, and it's something that we're going to be coming back to all semester long, again, because we're unfolding and we're tracing and tracking what we mean by political ecology continuously in this class, and we're going to do it pretty much every session. So for this session, I think I'd like to focus on two things about political ecology that I think are interesting and urgent to know about. And the first has to do with climate politics, has to do with global warming, and the forces in society, especially in the United States, that have pushed back and tried to skew and try to hijack the public discussion and the public opinion on global warming and our climate crises. This Naomi Klein writes about really wonderfully, really effectively in her book, This Changes Everything. And I highly recommend reading this book. Over the course of the semester, you could pick up this book, read one chapter here, one chapter there. This is in the second chapter, where she talks about the way in which right-wing forces, especially think tanks and dark money groups like the Heartland Institute, the way in which they've skewed public opinion and tried to muddy the waters of global warming and our need to act, right? And her ultimate argument is that a lot of these right-wing groups believe in like a fundamentalist free market capitalism, and if it turns out that global warming is anthropogenic, which it is, the overwhelming number of scientists agree that it is, that's no longer a debate, then that means the whole paradigm, the economic paradigm of unregulated free market capitalism, everyone is on their own and just trying to make money and profit. Well, then that's over. As an that's a mad, crazy economic system to have in place. If we're experiencing global warming, that's going to lead to untenable levels of heat on this planet that will eventually lead to civilizational breakdown, right? So that's her ultimate argument, and they go about, these right-wing forces, they go about and try to use pseudoscience, but also political pressure on scientists and so on and so forth, and through the media, they try to sort of muddy the waters. And they've done this since the 1990s. But if we think of the fossil fuel companies themselves, they've known about anthropogenic global warming since at least the 60s. They've had their own scientists working on it, so they knew about it, but then they kept it a secret, right? So this is like big tobacco in the 20th century. Big tobacco knew way early on that tobacco was bad for you, was carcinogenic, was really bad for people's health, but still tried to push their products, right? And we're seeing this today with food companies too. So ultra-processed foods, but also a lot of animal products we know are now carcinogenic, we know are really bad for our health, and yet you have multi-billion-dollar food industries that really try to keep that out of public knowledge because that'll be really bad for their bottom line. And all of these things that I'm describing are connected in one way or another to fossil fuels and to global warming, right? So you see the way in which political ecology connects with political questions, social questions, economic questions, and environmental questions. The other part of political ecology that I want to unfold for us a little bit this session is the relationship between fossil fuels and democracy. And here I have another book recommendation for those who are interested. It's a fantastic book by Timothy Mitchell. It's called Carbon Democracy. And he asks really a simple question, which turns out to be really complicated. What is the relationship between a democratic society and fossil fuels, especially petroleum? He's talking quite a bit about petroleum in his book. And he says a couple things which I think are really interesting and important to think about. He says, one, fossil fuels, especially petroleum, but also carbon and then steam and the Industrial Revolution, helped create modern democracy. This is pretty much incontestable, right? This is what led, at least in Europe and the United States, over the course of the last few centuries, this is what led to wealth, stability, and security, which allowed for the formation of democratic societies as we know them today. Interestingly enough, you even have people on the left that say fossil fuels were responsible for the formation of industry and economies and workforces, right? That's clear, right? People working on oil wells, people working in factories, and so on and so forth, which then led to the politicization of society, of these workers coming together, becoming unionized, and understanding their power. So there's an argument to be made that actually fossil fuels is what led to working class politics as we know it today. So some have made that argument. And so on the one hand, fossil fuels have helped create modern democracies, right? And this is a little scary. Ponder this question. What happens when oil becomes too scarce or can't be produced anymore? What happens to democratic societies then if they're founded on fossil fuel economies? That's a scary question, and that's a question that our move towards a Green New Deal, our move towards a more green economy, will have to think about. But that's just an aside. The other part that Mitchell points out is that yes, fossil fuels have led to modern democratic societies in the so-called West, but fossil fuels also limit democratic development. So it's almost like a paradox. And how does it limit democratic development? Well, you get the sense that the fossil fuels that helped Europe and the United States and Canada and other so-called developed countries accrue wealth security for democratic procedures, this was only in relation to destabilizing or facilitating authoritarian politics in those places in the world where the petroleum largely resides, right? And this is not just, but this is in the so-called Middle East, right? And in the introduction into Carbon Democracy, Timothy Mitchell talks about this. He says, it's no coincidence that, or he argues, it's no coincidence that around 2011 and the Arab Spring, that most, if not all of the countries that had an Arab Spring, Tunisia, so on and so forth, they are not major oil producing countries. Whereas the major producing oil countries, think of Iraq, think of Iran, think of Saudi Arabia, they seem to be politically the most authoritarian and the most regressive, right? And so Mitchell is making this argument that there's something about having these fossil fuels that limits democratic development where they are, where they're refined, not where they're refined, but where they are in the ground, right? It seems to create these oligarchic states, oligarchic authoritarian states that we find today, right? Think of many of these petro states in the Middle East. So they're connected to the global economy. They're connected to prosperity in Europe and the United States, and of course now in other parts of the world. But where they're located, where they're situated, democracy gets limited by them, right? So here we're fully into political ecology, right? We're talking about the way in which fossil fuels don't only provide us energy, but also lead to either democratic situations or limit democratic situation, depending on where you are geopolitically. So it's a fascinating thing to think about. And there are a number of artists, in this case a filmmaker, who have inspected this political ecology of fossil fuels, and especially war. Because I think we can't talk about fossil fuel democracy and politics without understanding all the interventions that have happened in the 20th century and that continue to happen because of oil. So go and look up in the 1950s what happened in Iran to the democratically elected leader who wants to nationalize the oil reserves in Iran. Learn what happens to him and how Iran then becomes, how the Shah of Iran comes into power and it effectively becomes an authoritarian dictatorship, right? All this is connected to the Suez Canal and to the ownership of crude oil and fossil fuels, right? And so Werner Herzog he's a wonderful filmmaker. I highly recommend watching a lot of his films. This one is really haunting. It's called Lessons of Darkness from 1992. Underneath this lecture, I'll go ahead and embed the trailer. So if anyone's interested, watch the trailer. And if you're even more interested, watch the whole film itself. It shows you the first Gulf War in Iraq in the early 90s. George Bush Sr. Started this war. And it shows you when the Iraqi army retreated from Kuwait, which was a small nation that was occupied by Iraq, that the U.S. came in to purportedly liberate. As they were retreating, they set fire to all the oil wells in Kuwait. And it's this incredible. So it's if you've heard in war theories about war, the scorched earth policy, right? You leave the earth scorched for your enemy, so they don't get anything. This is quite literally what the Iraqi forces did, and so that when the U.S. came in, there are these incredible scenes of the oil fields just shooting out fire because they've been lit. And so this certainly is showing us the ways in which the first Gulf War, but also the second Gulf War, is connected to the oil reserves that are in these very oil-rich parts of the world. And I think it used to be very controversial to say that these wars were about oil. These wars were about fossil fuels. But it seems like maybe it's no longer that controversial today. It seems pretty clear that part of the geopolitics of war in the past century has to do with making sure the right people own these energy sources, so that the economy and global trade and political alliances remain undisturbed, right? There's another interesting aspect of this work. Herzog, he says he purposely didn't leave any commentary, and this is what kind of makes it so interesting to watch. It's just footage, but he's such a great director that the footage is endlessly fascinating and kind of horrifying, but also weirdly compelling at the same time. We'll talk about that today. He didn't want to give any commentary. He just wanted you to be sort of embedded in this really eerie landscape, because he didn't like the way in which back then it was mainly CNN. Today we have many more, corporate news outlets. But he didn't like the way the news was reporting this. There's a way in which if you go into this scene without commentary, then you see it in a way that's a little more strange and ambivalent and not ready-made with meaning. Whereas if you see it with someone commentating, situating it within the context of U.S. foreign policy, then it's like you're kind of lulled into making sense of all this. He says we don't want to have this ready-made sense, because then it gives us a sense of security or a sense of knowledge, which might not be the reality on the ground, right? So this is one way in which art making and filmmaking can sort of destabilize the ways in which we're kind of coded to think about the world very, very far away, if all we're doing is having it filtered through corporate news media. So it's an interesting way of doing things. There's also an artist named Mark Lombardi. He was wonderful. He's known for these diagrams. So this is a very different way of trying to visualize the political economy. But what he does these very elaborate drawings that show you relationships, and the various relationships, the way things connect to one another. In this case, George W. Bush, who again not his son in 2003, who goes back into Iraq, but George Bush, the first of the first Gulf War. Mark Lombardi is showing you all the connections that Bush had to Harken Energy and to other business dealings and insider trading before the first Gulf War. And so you're able to sort of trace all the economic and political complicities that were in place before the U.S. went to war in Iraq. To liberate Kuwait, of course, right? That was part of the strategy. But one can't help but think that it was also advantageous for those that had financial connections to energy companies, right? So in a much more cerebral, conceptual way, Lombardi is showing you geopolitics. So whereas Herzog is more is much more visceral and image-based, Lombardi, this is much more conceptual, and you're able to see relationships in the world that otherwise are invisible. Like you can't really see them without this kind of more conceptual visualization. And I'm talking about the first Gulf War and the war in Iraq in 2003, which in many ways shapes our current realities. Not to mention the so-called war on terror, which has been pretty catastrophic to my mind. There are also very contemporary instances of this. So I would highly recommend everyone listen to the latest Intercept podcast on the connections between oil production, petroleum, gasoline in Yemen, and the horrible war there that's currently happening in Yemen. So there are ways in which these things are connected. So it's a moment of foreign policy and war that continues to be in many ways conditioned by this energy source, which is so important for the powers that be, right? So check out that podcast if you have time, and you'll become better informed about this war in Yemen that almost nobody talks about, which is incredible, because it's quite honestly incredibly sad and genocidal. One other work that I want to show you that relates to what we're talking about, which is different in scope because it's more oblique, like it's not as direct. There's something more or less direct about Herzog and Lombardi. But Kader Attia is one of my favorite artists. He's a French-Algerian artist. He's done all sorts of wonderful works. We'll meet him again at some point in the semester. But this is his short video work called Oil and Sugar from 2007. And you can find it online. I think someone has taken a video on their iPhone of this video inside of a black box, inside of the space in a museum where it's being shown. But it's very simple, but very evocative. So it's a plate of sugar cubes, then petroleum oil is put on top of these sugar cubes, and over the course of 4.5 minutes, you see this whole beautiful, clean, pristine structure of sugar become completely corroded, and it collapses. And so, in one sense, it shows the corrosiveness of oil, right? Both physically, but also you get the sense that we're talking about the corrosive effects of oil on society and politics and war. So there's probably a larger metaphoric resonance to this work, right? But it's not so simple as that, because sugar itself has its own history when it comes to war and colonial conquest. Before oil becomes the huge future of capitalism, sugar is a major source of wealth and resource for Europe in the history of colonization. Just think of Haiti alone and sugarcane and so on and so forth. So it's not like sugar is an innocent commodity right here, right? Oil has its own. There are all sorts of ways, and we can talk about sugar as being part of a larger political economy. And so this work, at least the way I'm reading it here, it seems to couple these converging histories of different elements and different, so-called natural resources, sugar, mining, coal, fossil fuels. It's as if those comprise the elemental history of capitalism. And next week we're going to add cattle and animal agriculture to the development of capitalism of the last 500 years as another important feature of this history we're tracing. And so it's a really wonderful work. But if you start thinking about these two materials that sort of collide here and create this chaos, we're going from order to chaos. They really, on a larger sense, they seem to point towards a history of what Naomi Klein calls, disaster capitalism, and the staple commodities that have driven it these past few centuries. And so finally, I think we could look at a few artists and think about the ways in which art has dovetailed into activism when it comes to fossil fuels, especially within the realm of what's called institutional critique. So there's a whole history of institutional critique going back to at least the 1970s of artists showing the ways in which museum institutions are actually complicit in fossil fuel economies, in political violence, and in the powerful forces that be, right? And so artists will hold a mirror up to the institutions of the museum, be it MoMA, be it the Metropolitan, be it the Whitney, and I'm only naming museums that are in New York City, major museums in New York City, holding a mirror up to them and showing that while they show incredible art at the upper echelons of power within that institution, the board of directors, and those that fund exhibitions, sometimes are the worst of the worst when it comes to political, economic, and ecological disaster and violence around the world. So this is art that doesn't use fossil fuels as a medium or represent fossil fuels so much as, again, hold up a mirror for the politics that infuse our culture. And we could think about the way in which, we're all tied to a university institution, a public one. So it would be interesting to see in what ways is CUNY complicit, in what ways is CUNY tied to financial endeavors, and business interests that we in our everyday lives we wouldn't be comfortable with, and in that sense, then we're in some ways connected to it, right? So let's look at a few artists that have done this. So now we're moving more towards a type of art that's activist, and maybe gives us more hope for change, because I realize that a lot of what we've been looking at and talking about today is dire. So the first is one of the key artists for the history of institutional critique, and that's the German artist named Hans Haacke. Wonderful artist. Check him out if you've never studied him before. He's one of the greats. This is his work called, it's hard to say, Metromobilität, from 1985, and it's a recreation of a section of the Metropolitan Museum. So that classical pediment that's up there, but also the awnings. If you've ever walked by the Metropolitan Museum, you'll know that they'll advertise their exhibitions with these large, really wonderful awnings of images that say, what's being shown, what's currently on display. And so at the time, there was a show called Treasures of Ancient Nigeria on display in 1985, which is wonderful, right? To have an exhibition of Nigerian art at the Metropolitan. I don't know enough of the history of African art in the Metropolitan, but I'm willing to guess that 1985 is pretty early. So this feels pretty progressive and attuned to other parts of the world, which is wonderful. And yet, it was largely supported by a grant from Mobil, a major oil company. And Hans Haacke picked up on this. And he of course, this is a research-based type of work, so he researched and he saw that Mobil, while it was championing ancient culture from Nigeria, it was also doing a lot of business and upholding apartheid and doing its part in upholding apartheid in South Africa at the very same time. And so on these banners, he shows you in the middle the banner that I believe is like a reproduction of the original banner of the show that was up at the Metropolitan at the Met, and then the other two banners he put up. And what do they say? It says Mobil's management in New York believes that its South African subsidiary sales to the police and the military are but a small part of its total sales. Total denial of supplies to the police and military forces of a host country is hardly consistent with an image of responsible citizenship in that country. And so he's pointing out the ways in which Mobil Oil was connectedly tied to apartheid powers in South Africa. So on the one hand, championing art from Nigeria, on the other hand, having concrete having concrete effects on the politics of apartheid in South Africa, which was apartheid means a state that's founded on racism. So white people in South Africa held the power and treated black people in South Africa as lower class citizens, often very violently. And so behind these two banners, there are actually images of victims of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So here we have a lesson in institutional critique that ties a political situation, South African apartheid, a museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and its financial connections to a major oil company, Mobil, right? And so this should make us all, and probably did make a lot of people, uneasy in 1985. And it strips away any innocence when it comes to going to look at art, to think that it's just its own separate thing and it's not involved or connected to geopolitical situations that we are that make us very uneasy and uncomfortable. There's a work that's more recent that has to do with that's in a similar vein, that has to do with the Tate Britain, with the Tate Museum in London. So the Tate Museums in London, the Tate Modern, but also the Tate Britain, they're the equivalents of MoMA and the Metropolitan Museum here. They're the major museums there. And here we're not talking about Mobil, we're talking about British Petroleum. And this is on the occasion, like a 20th anniversary occasion of an exhibition and British Petroleum sponsorship for the Tate. And so it's one of these, like fancy shindigs for sponsors. And these two activist artists named Anna Feigenbaum and Mel Evans, they did a work where they snuck in as if they were just, they're wearing nice dresses and as if they were just guests. But then at some point they take out these ponchos that have BP on it and they spill all this oil throughout this soiree. And then of course they're escorted out. I'm sure they were probably arrested. But they were trying to prove a point that we shouldn't be celebrating with a fancy shindig the sponsorship of the Tate Museum by BP. Because it's such a destructive industry environmentally, right? So this is a much more direct activist kind of work. And this would then lead to a loose group of artists and activists called Liberate Tate, that over the course of the last decade, 2010, that performance, this inaugurated in many ways Liberate Tate, and they did a whole bunch of other illegal public performance works, where they would get into the Tate and they would get by the guards, and they would do certain things to bring to light the complicity between the museum and BP and the financial ties. And so this is another one. I could show you a bunch of them. They have a nice website where they show their activities called Human Cost, where it's pretty elaborate how they did it, but they snuck in 2 oil canisters, and the two that are pouring Sorry, backtrack. So they snuck in these 2 canisters, and then one activist was designated to, at some point, just take off all their clothes and get into the fetal position on the ground, and then have oil poured all over their body. Again, as a form of performance art protest against the financing of the museum and being complicit with British Petroleum. And there's a success story here in many ways, because I think it's 2017 where finally the Tate divested from British Petroleum. And the divestment movements are interesting to talk about how effective they might be. I like to think that divesting from it's not the only type of activism that should be doing, but I think large institutions divesting from fossil fuel companies, but also big animal agriculture companies, which we'll talk about next week. I think that probably is an important part of the struggle for the struggle against environmental disaster and global warming and a better future. And speaking of that, I can't talk about activist groups without talking about, well, the Sunrise Movement. I don't have a slide for them, but if anyone wants to get active in the U.S., the Sunrise Movement is wonderful, fantastic. So hook up with them. But there's also Extinction Rebellion, which began in the UK, and they have all sorts of imaginative public forms of protest that often involve graphics, often involve performance strategies, and often involve art in one way or another. So they give us reason for hope and forms of resistance going forward. And so I'm going to conclude with something a little odd, I suppose, but I just find this work kind of interesting. And it's actually not a work, although it is pointed out by an artist who's written about this. And it's just simply a nice lead-in to our next class. And that's the fact that oil, fossil fuels, but we're speaking specifically about oil here, it's toxic. No animal, no life form lives oil. It's corrosive to organic life as we know it, except for one type of fly, which they've discovered, I think, in 1899. They called the fly. It's been since named the oil fly, and they realized that this fly lives on petroleum. And it has no problem living on petroleum. It even lays its eggs, its larvae, its legs, and incubates deep into the petroleum. And so it's this weird creature that thrives in what for every other animal, as far as we know, is completely toxic, right? And so scientists are now trying to study this fly because they think that inside its guts there's an enzyme, or there's a type of bacteria, just like us. We're more, our microbiome, the bacteria and viruses and all the things and the fungi that are in our microbiome, which have a lot of say of how we think and how we feel. There are more of those than any other cell in our body, by a magnitude of quite a bit. So they're studying these flies, the guts of these flies, because they think there's a bacteria and an enzyme here that will help us in eating oil, which again would be really helpful for plastic, right? To be able to find a way to almost like hack an animal in order to then use its enzymes to deal with pollution, right? And recently, I think they found bacteria that has evolved and is starting to eat plastic. So this is a very interesting thing to think about. Are one of the possible solutions to the climate disasters that we talk about in this class, are there things available out there already that we can learn from? We can learn from this fly and understand then how to deal with the polluting agents that are, in this case, petroleum and plastic and all its derivatives, which now litter the whole world. I think last class I told you, in the Antarctica they've already found particulate plastic. So this is an interesting question, and it's a nice lead-in to the topic for next week,
which is going to be about the role of animals in our class and in our age of climate crises and disasters. And as it turns out, animals play a sizable role. So the order I have for our first 2 sessions is we start with fossil fuels, because when it comes to global warming and the emission of CO2, it's the highest culprit. It's the highest part of the pie of the chart. But the second highest, especially through methane, when it comes to global warming, is animal agriculture. So that's what we're going to tackle next.
And so this work by Kader Attia is an example of a contemporary artist actually using oil, using petroleum as a medium, as a material for his artwork, right? And so let's look at a few more objects that fall into this category. And one of the first artworks to do this is by a Japanese artist, Noriyuki Haraguchi, his oil pool from 1971. He's one of the first to use oil as a medium. So it's this large basin, it's this large pool filled with crude oil. It was first shown in 1971, and later on it would be acquired by the Tehran Museum of Art, so in Iran, which is, I believe it's still there today in its atrium. Actually, I know for a fact it's still there today in its atrium. And so it's a really wonderful work in many ways. The way the artist is talked about is that he considered to be a reflecting pool, almost like a place for meditation. So there's a Buddhist aspect to this work, but I think there's also within that spiritual tradition of self-contemplation or non-self contemplation in Buddhism. In the West, we might also think about Narcissus. We might also think about the mythology that you can read about in several places, I think, but Ovid is probably the most well-known, of the boy who's so beautiful, considers himself to be so beautiful that he can't stop looking at himself in the pool of water, and he shrivels away and dies and becomes the flower Narcissus, that we still call this flower Narcissus today. And so as a reflecting pool, maybe there is a way in which narcissism or self-interest can be connected to oil, right? In lots of different ways. So that could be an interesting interpretation. There's also something impenetrable about this work. When you normally look at a reflecting pool, it would be in water. There's probably something somewhat translucent. There's something really opaque about oil, dense, impenetrable, like you can't reach. So that must have, I've never seen this in person, but that must have a real effect on the viewer, this pool that one can't really access, like they can't really get into it. There's something impenetrable. So there's probably a certain amount of power that this object has when you're seeing it in the space. There's also, I can't help but think of, this is a lot of oil within the context of how much oil is burned every day. This is nothing, a drop in the oil bucket. But still, this is an artwork that holds the oil hostage. And why do I say that? Is because it can't be used. Right? This is oil that's art that now can't be used. It simply sits there. So its energy is being diverted, not burned, but diverted towards art making. So that's really interesting. And I think there are lots of ways to interpret this work, and you may give it a different interpretation, which is wonderful. I think the way I interpret it the most, or the way I think I would think of it if I saw it in person, the way it would make me feel, I would think about the precariousness of containment. I would think about how, it's almost like an infinity pool, like the oil comes right up to the edge. And so it would have this powerful force in the space of containing this very powerful liquid. Probably it's a liquid that's created the most wealth and the most power in human history. But there's something really, really precarious. I would almost worried about spilling out
or things breaking and then losing. Like oil will go everywhere. So it's this material, it's this liquid that looks like here it's just perfectly contained, but at any moment it might feel it could be. I've never seen it in person. I've never felt it in person, so I don't know. But it would almost feel like at any moment now, this liquid I know can't really be contained. It's amorphous. It's going to get everywhere, and everything is really precarious. And so this gets me to think about the history of oil spills in the 20th century, and even more recently, and probably the most famous, notorious, and catastrophic was the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which happened on March 24th, 1989. Not too long ago after this work is made. Though I do know the artist, it wasn't the first oil spill, so I know this artist was thinking about and had oil spills in mind when he was thinking and formulating and making this work in the early 70s. And so if we're talking about oil spills, we're talking about contamination. And we're talking about taking a fossil fuel that has been in the ground for millions of years and putting it somewhere where it shouldn't be within the context of the ecosystem and the environment as we know it today, right? This is again where human activity and non-human time collapse and confront each other, often catastrophically. And so Mark Dion, he's a wonderful artist who's we'll meet him again in this class too, just like Karavatya. And he's done a number of works that critique the separation of culture and nature in the way we talked about it in our first class. And he often does this with natural history displays. Because if there's ever a place that we go to that sort of reinforces and consolidates the idea that human culture is separate from nature, it's a natural history museum. You go in, you pay your ticket, and then all these wonderful things are there. All the animals have been hunted down long ago and killed and stuffed. They're behind glass and they're posed to look like they're in a natural setting, usually devoid of all human activity. So there's something about these natural history displays that keep you as a human separate from them, and then nature is a pristine thing out there that's unconnected to you. A lot of nature shows work that way too, right? Mark Dion wants to collapse this, and he wants to show that no, there is no such thing as this uncontaminated nature. Human culture and nature are one thing. Another philosopher named Donna Haraway, she talks about nature culture as one word to emphasize the fact that there is no separation between human culture and non-human nature. And in fact, next week we're going to talk about how animals have culture and communities and language and so on and so forth. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. So clearly, in his Tar Museum from 2006, Mark Dion is collapsing the aesthetics of the natural history display with human activity, human industry, and in this case, tar. So there are these animals that could have been these stuffed animals that could have been in a natural history display that he's coated in tar to show, and it's wonderful. They're on these boxes called that are fragile, handle with care, and that there's like this bittersweet poetic irony here that these animals, when they're alive in the wild, they're not treated with care. They're not treated as fragile entities that think, that live and breathe. They're not treated that way. So much so that in an oil spill, they're collateral damage. But when they become a stuffed animal to be displayed or a work of art, then they do become fragile. They do become important, right? So it's almost as if they're more important dead for human culture, in the history of human culture, than they are alive, arguably. At least this is one idea that comes out of this work by Mark Dion. But above all, I think he's highlighting, it's very clear, it's very direct, he's highlighting the way in which so-called wildlife is affected by human activity, oil spills, and tar. And this is a good moment to mention that currently in the past 10 10, 20 years to try to get at other forms of oil, other ways of getting to oil in the ground. Industry has started using different things. Like I'm sure you've heard of hydraulic fracking. That's a way to get to natural gas and to fossil fuels and to petroleum, right? You may have also heard about the Alberta tar sands. So it's an especially dirty version of crude oil that industry is trying to get because oil is such a valuable commodity in the world, with devastating repercussions for both human and non-human communities in Alberta, in Canada. But if you factor in global warming, everybody, right? All of us that are alive on this planet, human and non-human. So Mark Dion is really making us focus on this issue and in this sort of larger context. So it's a really interesting work to think about and think through. Probably the most, for me, this is a really catastrophic, it's a hard image to look at. It's a pelican that's coated in oil, probably can't even take off anymore. And this is an image from 2010 that has to do with probably the most visible oil spill, oil disaster ever now. I'm sure it's eclipsed the Exxon Valdez, and that's the British Petroleum BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So this was an underground well that broke, and oil just kept gushing out into the Gulf, and creating all sorts of disaster and destruction. And there's a photographer who was commissioned by National Geographic to go and document this disaster. His name's Daniel Beltra, and I show you. There are a number of them. So if you're interested in these images, just search for them, because there are more that you can find online. But here you're seeing the oil well, you're seeing a tanker, and you're seeing these incredible colors. I don't even know how he got these colors. Of the oil spill itself. Here's another one of a tanker on this oil slick on the water with these tons of oil being spewed out into the Gulf. And again, I can't help, it's just such a strange thought that the human activity is able to take this element, this liquid that's been deep underground for millions of years, and bring it to the surface and spread it out in the ecosystem in a way that is devastating for that ecosystem. So here I think we could get back to ideas about what's natural or unnatural, and have a really interesting conversation. The other thing that interests me about these images, and that I also worry about, and this is something else that you could write about or think about when we get together to discuss, is the problem of these images being so arguably beautiful. These are incredible photographs, and they mingle horror, they mingle this disaster with beauty. So there are histories of this in Western philosophy and aesthetics of the sublime. The sublime, long story short, is an experience of something that's both scary and pleasurable, right? So I worry about this type of photography. What does it mean to look at a natural disaster and find beauty in it? Does it matter? Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Or does it create a certain type of distance? Does it sort of placate us in some way? Does it make us feel better about our place in the world in these disasters? I don't know, but it's a really interesting question to mull over and to think through.